I wanted to switch gears now, and I wanted to talk about a whole other area of research that you've focused on, which deals with this intersection of social movements and what you call hipster products.
Yeah.
Can you talk us through some of that?
Sure. So this research is motivated by a theory called resource partitioning theory, which is pretty technical, but it basically says that in certain industries, there will be a consolidation of production among generalist producers who give homogeneous goods to a heterogeneous population. So what does that mean? It's a mouthful. What does that mean? The classic setting for this is beer brewing, and it's not hard to remember the days when you had a choice of things like Miller and Coors and Bud and maybe Molson if you were stretching it a little bit, and there were about 40 local producers that were not part of that big industrial complex in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So a really small population of specialist producers. What this theory says is that when we get these huge organizations that are serving kind of watered down beer to people who are fine with it, then we get space opened up in the market for specialist producers to serve specialist audiences. So we get very local brew pubs popping up or very small microbreweries that serve really local populations that are interested in something different. And at that stage of market development, we get the people that are interested in those products also being interested in the identity of the producer. So they're really looking for purity of what I would call organizational form, right? Which we think about as authenticity. So in that case, it's not so much about the characteristics of the product, but the way that it's produced. So this might come to light a little bit better if I use another example, which is organic agriculture, organic produce. So, you know, in the 20th century in the United States, we had huge agro-industrial farming take over and very little small-scale farming for decades. Because it was efficient, because there were government subsidies, because we had advances in technology, because we had a booming population to feed. So lots of reasons why that came to pass. And then we got these fringe hippies, right? People who were really interested in the purity of the food, which had to be a function of the purity with which it was produced. So they were interested in no pesticides because they didn't believe in chemicals, right? And no fertilizer because they didn't believe in damaging the earth. And crop rotation because that's the purer way. So like there are a lot of components of that production process that are ideologically driven. Early consumers of organic food were really driven by that ideology. And in fact, that ideology was a turnoff to lots of other consumers. So when Earthbound Farms, one of the biggest producers of organic greens in the United States, first started selling its products through Walmart, Walmart asked that they take the word organic off the label because people had a generally negative association with that word, right? The organic connoted something hippie, dirty, alternative, weird. And in fact, you know, I remember growing up with one health food store. Those of us who were born in the 70s remember health food stores. And they always looked kind of grimy and a little bit dirty around the edges. And you had to pull your amaranth out from the bulk bins, right? There was like a strong connotation and image of what that meant. And so the population that was interested in purchasing that was really very limited. Over time, the number of people that became interested in buying less chemically treated, less genetically modified, cleaner produce became much broader. And it became less about the ideology of the producer and the purity of that production process and more about the product characteristics, right? So what I want as an organic consumer, if you're an everyday person, is an apple that tastes good and doesn't look perfect, right? What I want is not that perfect red delicious apple. I want something that's different from that homogeneous, bland product. It's not that I'm driven by this really deep ideology, it's really just about the product characteristics, and maybe a bit of it is about expressing an identity that's different from this mass consumerism, homogeneous production.
How does that intersect with sustainability? And you know, I'm thinking of Tom's, and there's so many examples of other companies. What's happening first? Is it the social movement that's crying out for it, and the brands jump on the bandwagon, or how does that work?
So in many, many cases, so I'm thinking about Tom's, I'm thinking about Burt's Bees, even Ben & Jerry's, the social mission preceded the popularization of that production, of that consumption pattern, right? So the people who, my friends I remember in college who used Tom's products, I thought were really weirdos. Why were they using this smelly toothpaste, right? Or why were they interested in organic bee products? Why wasn't, the Jergens lotion good enough for them? And so that social mission really built up the consumer base, and then over time, people's consumption preferences catch up with that vanguard. So over time, the scale of production becomes so great and the social mission becomes so diluted by the popularity of the product itself that we get a totally different market dynamic. And so that's why we now see competition, going back to my original example about beer. 30 years ago, you didn't see major industrial brewers with successful microbrew lines, because people who were interested in microbrews would find out and make sure that nobody drank them. And the people that were not interested in microbrews didn't think they were tasty to begin with, so there was no market for them. Now what we see is those large producers are coming out with microbrew lines, and they're kind of sneaky about it, they're kind of secretive about it, or they're buying up ownership stakes in successful local breweries. And what you find is, if you ask even people who are kind of devoted craft brew drinkers, whether they know who brews, who produces their favorite beers, they're not really so interested. They're more interested in consuming this as an expression of who they are as people, as a mark of discernment, because they like the taste of this rather than that, and because kind of as an afterthought, it's not that homogeneous product. So the motivation changes, and when that motivation changes, we get a lot of freedom to change our ownership structure, to change our organizational structure, and really to move away from that original mission without many people noticing.
But from a brand marketing standpoint, then if all these, the people that were interested in the microbreweries from the beginning, if they learned that, oh, Budweiser is actually the one producing it, would they walk away from it? And what does a Budweiser or, a big conglomerate do in terms of the branding of these products?
Yeah, so what we're finding in our research is that there's still a core group of people who are going to walk away from that product if they find out that it's owned by Bud or InBev or whatever it is. But those people are generally newbies, so they're the 23-year-olds who just discovered what craft beer is and decided that they're really purists about it. And over time, they become less ideological. And also over time, that modal consumer becomes a lot less ideologically driven. So if you're a Bud brand manager and want to hide the fact that your microbrew is actually an industrial brew, or kind of an industrial brew, then you can do things to just kind of prevent that association from being made, which is not really difficult. You just don't put Bud on the label. You have the same corporate headquarters, but no mention of it in any of the marketing or customer-facing identity statements for the microbrew. On the other hand, if you're a really authentic, quote-unquote, microbrew, you can capitalize on this by advertising that you are independent, that you've been independent for X number of years, that you have a really pure production process. And even for people that are not really ideologically discerning, that ought to make a difference at the end of the day.
So the key is to know your audience then, right?
For sure, the key is to know your audience.
In terms of the consumption patterns, is there a life cycle or a lifespan where it becomes uncool?
To drink microbrews?
Yeah. I mean, if that original group is starting to get the sense of it's less authentic.
That's a great question. I don't think we've seen the market develop for either organic food or microbrews, or the new kind of products are micro-distilled bourbons or whiskeys, those sorts of hipster products, right, that are lifestyle products. We haven't yet seen a backlash, so it's hard to say. There is a period where backlash is really a problem, and it's in that kind of middle period where the movement, the consumption movement, the identity movement is really taking off and becoming popular. At that stage, you are easily tainted by association with some unhip, homogenous, generalist producer. But that's not, I don't know that there's a longer term effect of that. It'll be interesting to see.
So you're saying what started as a pure social movement then can get somewhat diluted over time as bigger corporations take over?
It's not just as bigger and bigger corporations take over, it's as more and more people get interested. So it's kind of a curse of success, right? We're interested in healthy food and food purity. And as more and more people get interested in food purity, which seems like a win from the movement's perspective, right? Now we've got all the support, now we can make something happen. All of a sudden, most of those people don't care as much as those first few adherents cared. And so the power that they bring with them becomes a power for dilution rather than a power for adherence to those, to those ideology goals.
So what can we do as business leaders to address that discrepancy?
Well, it depends which side of the aisle you're on, right? So if you're a big producer that wants to come to scale, go take it and run with it. If you're a kind of more ideologically motivated producer, then your goal should not be to get to scale. Your goal should be to serve your consumer base really, really well and to know who they are and what drives them and to respond to that. And I'm a big supporter of local business for that reason. It's not just because, I mean, there's an important component of supporting the people in our actual communities, but buying local means that you know what people are doing and they know you and they know how to serve you really, really well. And you're not going to get that same kind of service from an industrial potato farm in Idaho. You're just not.